day and age, and that is how we deal with corporate social responsibility during an era of pandemic. And with me today are two wonderful friends as well as experts in the field, and that is Bill Novelli and Isabella Bunn. First of all, just to briefly introduce Bill. Bill is currently a distinguished professor of the practice at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. And as you can see behind him are the words business impact, which is very much a part of what he is doing and heading up a wonderful center that really does deal quite a bit with corporate social responsibility. He is a co-founder of Parker Novelli, the global PR firm, and at one time was the chief operating officer of Care USA, and for about 9 years was indeed the CEO of AARP right here in the United States, based in Washington, D.C., and he's with us today from Washington. Across the pond is Isabella Bunn, Dr. Isabella Bunn, who was at Oxford in England, and she's very much associated with Oxford University at Regent's Park College, as well as the Oxford Analytica group, which is very much a part of who we're working with these days at the Washington Institute. And she's also a distinguished professor at the Fisk College of Business at Florida Institute of Technology. And I'm delighted that Bill is a member of the Advisory Council of the Washington Institute, and Isabella is one of the distinguished fellows at the Institute. And so if I may, I'm going to begin talking with Isabella to really begin to focus on the notion of how the coronavirus has changed the attitudes of so many people, not just in the United States, but around the world, in being able to deal with social responsibility and how the paradigm has shifted in so many ways. Isabella?
Thank you for so much, Jim, and thank you, Bill. And it's a pleasure to be joining this conversation. And I think the first thing I would like to mention about corporate social responsibility is probably that terminology is becoming a little bit outdated. It sounds like a department that does activities within a company, when in fact, this brilliant way that Bill has reframed it, social impact, also environmental impact, and also governance questions will now permeate this question of what we used to call corporate social responsibility. And it's much more strategic across the company in every one of its functions in terms of the company's activities. But what strikes me, of course, is that we're not just in a health crisis or a pandemic. We're also experiencing obviously an economic crisis, a social justice crisis, and at the same time, perhaps interestingly, the climate crisis has also been heightened during this period of time. So I think the reshaping of the role of business relates to all of those crises. And I think it's been a very interesting element to see how business has come to the fore and has engaged and participated in solutions to all of these crises in a very dramatic way, when it might have been quite natural to retrench and just try to focus on the survivability of the company as such. So I think, interestingly, this could be a very optimistic time for the future of what we used to call corporate social responsibility, much more integrated across business functions, much more embedded in broader social goals like the Sustainable Development Agenda of the United Nations, also much more trusted and playing a more important role vis-a-vis the employees and their well-being, and also a much more creative role in terms of problem solving and dialogue. So Jim, when you founded the Institute using business, government, and society as the framing, we could not have imagined just how important not just each of those elements are, but the interrelationship between the three, which is going to be transformed going forward. And part of that debate, and we'll be talking about reputation, we'll be talking about purpose, certainly a rethinking of capitalism, rethinking of the role of stakeholders, and this broad social responsibility of business in a very elevated perspective going forward. So this perfect time to have this conversation.
Well, that's great. And it's also a perfect time because Bill Novelli has just published this month this wonderful book by Johns Hopkins Press, Good Business, The Talk, Fight, Win Way to Change the World. And Bill has been so much involved in and Isabel, by the way, and I both have had a chance to read this. And at the end of this program, you'll learn more about how to obtain it, notwithstanding Amazon. But indeed, uh, Bill, it's amazing how things have progressed over this period of time. And the book is terrific in as much as it gives everyone a good idea as to how you really got into the business of social marketing and how important this has become. So you get a combination of your insights built up over many years, but also a bit of an autobiography, which I certainly enjoyed going through. But how would you, thinking about all that you discuss in the book, and given what we're facing right now, how would you put into context the evolution of social responsibility, and particularly on the part of companies and how they deal with social responsibility?
Well, Jim, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on your program. It's a real joy, and I think that as Isabella said, you are right at the nexus. You are at the nexus of business, of government, of society, and that's where we are. That's the opportunity that I think we have today. So my career has been about half in the private sector, and about half in what I call civil society, and I had a short stint in government. And what I've learned over the years is that, as Isabella said, companies are moving. They're moving along a continuum, and maybe CSR is a bit outdated. I agree with that as a term, but whatever we want to call it, doing well by doing good, or shared value, or ESG. I think what's happening is companies are realizing that they can create economic value for their stockholders, but they can do more. They can serve other stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers, their customers, their clients, regulators, investors, by basically by doing good. And so what we have here is a kind of a powerful trend that's moving our way.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting that I would love to hear both of you speak to, but there, of course, was the day when areas of social responsibility became a division within a corporation, so that they could advance the notion that they were good guys, et cetera. But it now seems as though it's becoming more and more a part of the DNA of corporations. It's not simply something that's been sectored off somewhere. It also seems as though the coronavirus, if it's done anything, has accelerated that trend. What do you think, Bill?
I think you're right. I think less and less we see companies with a corner office with 3 or 4 people who are in charge of CSR. What's happening is it's becoming embedded and infused throughout companies. And I have a colleague, she is the head of this area for CVS Health. Her name is Eileen Boone. And what Eileen says is, I am the best recruiter you can imagine for our company. Pharmacists, truck drivers, all kinds of people want to come to CVS Health, and they want to come because they see that this is what we do. So you're absolutely right. It's way bigger than 3 or 4 people running a department.
Yes, indeed. Isabella, what are your thoughts?
I think what's fascinating along the lines of Bill's explanation, I think there's so many drivers now of reshaping this notion of the responsibility of business. And one of them certainly, and Bill's firm is at the forefront of analyzing this notion of corporate purpose. They have a premium index to try to analyze what is it about a company that upholds purpose, and what kind of difference does it make in terms of its perception and its overall success. I think some people on the call will be familiar with the huge amount of attention when the Business Roundtable made their statement about corporate purpose. And there's also serious academic work going around about that process, including at Oxford and with the British Academy. They have a Future of the Corporation program that looks to exactly that. What are the trends that are reshaping the business entity? And they looked at things like the impact of technology, the erosion of trust, how do you regulate business and so forth. And they have this new construct for business, which, and I'll read it because it's quite an interesting and challenging statement. The conclusion is that the purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably and not profit from causing problems. So that really is a new paradigm about not only our expectations, but also what the business does and how it contributes to society, and not just in a do no harm way, but in a positive way. And perhaps on another occasion, we can spend some time on another webinar talking about what those principles are, which they've developed with a team of academics and experts and business leaders, but also with the financial sector, because the other driver we see, this other bit of shorthand on ESG, the BlackRock letter, to use another shorthand way of communicating it, the importance of environmental and social factors to a business's performance, and then the strength of the board, the corporate board, in making sure that those elements are both appreciated, enhanced, and ideally measured in some way. And investors are judging companies based on that ESG performance. And that has been, in addition to that, there's the whole investment, the impact investment movement. But the result of that is every company have to then sit and look and say, what are we doing on the environmental side, on the social side? How can we also enhance our board performance? And when these crises, these converging crises hit, the board and the management would have to look at the full spectrum of company activity and ask that question: how are we doing on the E, in other words, on the environmental and sustainable side? How are we doing on the S for social? And in particular with the crisis, how are we taking care of our employees, our workers, our pension funds, their well-being? And also enormous changes on the board, including tying almost to that point I made about the social justice question. What about our diversity on the boards? How do we be inclusive at the highest level of business and then set that example throughout business as a whole? So it's a remarkable, I think, set of drivers. It would make a fascinating study just to look at what is driving this change in corporate social responsibility to make it much more integrated and much more important. And purpose is certainly part of that equation.
To build on that, Bill, I couldn't help but think throughout your book that you spent a great deal of time thinking about other people. I found that you, in the way you're discussing about your experiences, you make clear that your success comes only by virtue of the great team that you build that are surrounding you at any given time. There's almost a certain amount of spirituality to it, in the sense that, if you look out for other people, that your own situation is going to be enhanced, and then you take that from the way you individually perceive and act to the corporation and the corporate culture. And I think it's a wonderful way to be able to think of one's life in terms of what you're doing, and at the end of the day, what you're going to be able to look back on.
But Jim, you're really kind to say that. Here's how I think about it. When I was at AARP, and this is true of any large organization, I used to say to myself, there are maybe 100 decisions a day that are driving this organization, and I'm making about 5 of them. So who's making the other 95 decisions? And the answer is our executive team and their teams and the teams below them. And I don't think I've ever accomplished anything without teams. I mean, teams move mountains. And yes, you want to nurture a team, of course, and you want to help them to succeed. And if you do that, or if you want to do that, you've got to let them tell you what's wrong with your ideas. So that leads you to having to check your ego at the door. And then there's another aspect that I think about, which is not so much fun. I mean, it's fun to form teams. It's fun to hire people. But as you know, sometimes you have to remove people from a team. And if somebody's not rowing in the same direction as everyone else, it doesn't do the team a service, and it doesn't do the individual a good service either. So when we think about teams, we think about how to make them work, how to nurture them, how to give them the opportunity to succeed. And I think if we can do that, and if we do that, then we make progress.
Indeed. And it reminds me too, of course, Bill, the old adage of Jack Welch, who he would look at employees and he'd let them stay on for 3 or 4 years, and if they didn't progress, then they would find the door. And so some media began to attack the notion that he was this terrible individual. But his response was, if you're not thriving in this situation, this is not where you should be. And so there's a certain attitude, almost a Christian-like attitude, to be able to see that that you're sent off to go find exactly what life was meant for you. Anyway, Isabel, what do you think about all that?
Well, what I'd love to ask Bill, because I think it goes to a very important question, which is corporate culture. How is it, and you've done so much work on reputation, Bill, and you are a pioneer in public relations, so you deeply understand how things are received and understood. But this notion of corporate culture and the values that underpin it, how is that developed and built over time? How is it infused throughout the corporation? How does it affect the boardroom right down to the shop floor, if I can put it that way? And what difference does it make? So I'm a lawyer, so a lawyer tends to be compliance focused, but I think that corporate culture can do far more for the good that a company can do than any amount of regulatory information and requirement and checklists as far as the legal side, if I can put it the way, or the regulatory side. So I would love to get your impression, based on your 50 years of experience, the values-driven aspect of culture. How do these values take shape? How are they transmitted? And what difference does that make in terms of the company's both performance and also in terms of its reputation?
Well, Isabella, I really agree with you about culture. I think it's so important. And we've all heard that old adage that culture eats strategy for lunch, for breakfast and lunch and dinner. And
tea time. I'm in England.
I believe it's true. And the hardest thing in the world is to change a corporate culture, especially when people are comfortable. And so my thought is, and this is going to sound a bit like a cliche, but it is not. My thought is that you really need to have a great vision. And I'm not talking about going out into the desert and praying and coming back and saying, I have a vision. A vision can be developed from teams, from thinking, from listening. But if you have a great vision and you organize around that vision, I think then you can have a real effect on culture. And today, as you talked about corporate reputation, you can destroy a corporate reputation in a very, very short time. And in modern social media, with the transparency we have, we talk about citizen journalists and citizen scientists. You can't get away with much. And so what you have to do is have a really important, I'll call it tone from the top, ethical behavior, a vision that people can rally around, and a way really to make people understand that we're all going in the same direction together.
Bill,
what about the advantage of the corporate culture? One thing that I hear, especially since we're both involved on the teaching side, is that next generation, they want to work for a company that reflects their values, that there is a certain alignment. There are certain companies they won't work for, even though they maybe have a good career path, because they really see the company culture and their values as something very personal to them. And how do you find that, especially with your students at the Social Impact Center and the next generation of entrepreneurs? How important is corporate culture to them?
Corporate culture is very important to them. And today I teach MBA students, and also we have undergraduate business students. And what I think they basically want is, and they put it this way: they say, I want purpose as well as a paycheck. And they want to work for companies that they think are doing well by doing good. They want to work for companies that have in mind people, planet, and, as you say, profit. And today's students, but also alumni, young career people, have that attitude. And the really interesting thing is that companies are understanding it. They're beginning to get that. They get the idea. And so they recognize that they've basically got to provide that purpose if they're going to keep all that talent.
But you know, it's funny, Bill. I so agree with you. And having begun teaching until just a couple of years ago at Georgetown, since I like to say the last century, back in 1999, I found that I would spend time talking about their future careers, and invariably one person would put his hand up or her hand up and say, "Which area of business should I go into in which I'll make the most money?" And it was always camouflaged in a very sophisticated way. And of course, I would always, understand exactly what they were talking about. But and then my answer always was, if you don't find something that you can be passionate about, it doesn't matter. You've got to find something that you can really be passionate about. But over time, I found as well that there was a greater interest in being able to be engaged in something that was beyond the dollar. And we, for example, at the Washington Institute now, I'm delighted that as a result of the pandemic and the problems of the workforce, particularly young people leaving college and graduate school and entering into the workforce, that there were people very talented, very bright, very dedicated, who have decided they wanted to be a part for a while of the Washington Institute, so that they could take their talents while they're waiting to see what their next career move is. And they're able to get a title, they're able to be mentored, they're able to get a good recommendation for their good hard work. And so it's really been a wonderful, wonderful relationship. How have you, Isabella, found students over time and the changing attitudes that they've developed?
There is no question that and I think I have to be candid also, that there's among students generally quite a bit of skepticism about business and the private sector. And there is some sort of negative corporate feeling, I think, very broadly across the generation. But at the same time, I think that students are recognizing the potential of business as a force for good. And it's exactly what Bill is doing and what you have done, is trying to tap into that and then see how that is going to change not just the culture that we're talking about, but really business activity more broadly. So I think it's a fascinating development. And then, of course, alongside the corporate sector, if I could put it that way, we also really have this fourth sector of social enterprise and businesses that are set up for a particular purpose in terms of their social good as opposed to their profit as such. So it's an interesting dynamic. And certainly at Oxford, it's one of their great strengths. They have the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And it's something that is recognized as a subject in its own right, but it also permeates across the more traditional aspects of education as far as the MBA program is concerned. And all of that is linked to a very strong also entrepreneurial aspect and cultivating the strengths of entrepreneurs, not just in social enterprise, but really across the board, including in very well-established companies.
Right.
So
we've been getting quite a few questions, but interestingly enough, most of the questions have been trying to figure out about what's going to happen with young people into the future. I think it's interesting because you were referring to it earlier, Isabella, about the Business Roundtable's new approach that that shareholders, stockholders, stakeholders, that this is a much broader group of people that businesses need to be able to appeal to than it has been in the olden days. This all came before the pandemic, and I presume both of you would agree that the pandemic has only accentuated this notion that if it had not been for the coronavirus, that perhaps we would be evolving much more slowly than we are now. Would you agree?
There's certainly no question. I mean, I think when we all started our initial teaching materials way back when, there was something called stakeholder engagement, and that was a thing to do, often on the part of the corporate social responsibility department. That has been broadened to now we're talking about stakeholder capitalism, where it's really the stakeholder that drives this perception of the entire driving of economic activity as a whole. So I do think there is a profound shift of not just sort of engaging with your stakeholders as something good to do, but something that is intrinsically going to drive the success of the business, and that the business will be judged on that. And it ties back to these pressures from the environmental and the social factors, because how you engage with stakeholders obviously plays into that. And I think this climate change crisis is another perfect example of how so many stakeholders have to gather around the solutions, whether it's business, government, civil society, academics, scientists, cities, counties, at every level of government, from the United Nations right down to the smallest village, and dealing with a range of both technical and social and economic problems that the just transition brings into play. And I think the fact that we do have on a virtual basis, but we will be having the COP gathering in Glasgow later this year. Also, the G7 will be hosted in the UK. I think there's also this policy convergence, this focus of attention, and expectations are heightening on what will be delivered in terms of a green future, sustainable future, very much tied to the next generation. The definition of sustainability is always to look out for that next generation. And I think this current generation is very much tapped into that, and they have very high expectations. But I think one of the great things about our educational institutions, it can give them some entry points on how is it that they make a difference. Just an aside, I grew up in the Washington area, and a colleague of mine was making a very serious academic presentation at Oxford and asked me to respond to it. It was about climate change and some sort of technical and moral issues surrounding it. And I was reminded about the very first Earth Day, and actually sort of marching in Washington and demanding essentially a cleaner environment. And, to be honest, at the time, it was sort of, part protest and part street party. But looking back to think about those early starts in the 70s, the difference that did make, that young generation saying, we want something different, how that did actually affect the Clean Air Act and other kinds of regulatory measures, and put the question on the agenda, and now it's moving forward. So I think there is some continuity even with the older generation on how these things take shape. But I think it's also something that companies are doing in terms of, I love this, and I'm sure you teach about this notion of the circular economy, and not just rethinking the technology to be green, but also rethinking business models and value chains, and also going from a short-term perspective across the board to a long-term perspective, which is something that sustainability demands. So I think there's this fascinating dynamic about sustainability and climate change that's playing in right now with the crisis. And I think some of it has been driven by the supply chain disruptions. And suddenly people see, well, why is it, what is actually happening in those distant supply chains, and how can the conditions of the workers in those supply chains be elevated? I think there's much more awareness, ethical awareness about choices in this new generation, whether it's where they work, what cars they drive, or what vehicles they drive, how, the whole notion of urban mobility, what they purchase, what they consume, how they see the vision of the future unfolding, what policymakers, huge responsibility there, I think, on the part of our governments, again, at every level. So I think that's going to be a major driving force going forward, this sustainability aspect, and companies to deliver on that. It's a huge role for the companies, but also huge opportunity for companies as well, in terms of new technologies and new profitable areas of business. So
that sounds great.
I would love Bill's take on, again, because you're such an expert on corporate reputation, this whole notion of green and having the green reputation, and what about greenwashing? Tell me a little bit about greenwashing, and how do you identify it, and what do you do about it?
Well, as I was saying earlier, Isabella, I think the way things are today, there's so much transparency that it's more and more difficult to get away with something like greenwashing. Companies realize they have to be authentic. They have to be truthful. I'm not saying that, there's not going to be any misbehavior. You can just open up the Financial Times any day and you'll see that. But I think what's happening is companies are learning how to speak out. Their employees want it. Their customers and their consumers want it. and more, they're speaking out. It might be about, in this country, it might be about gun control. Certainly, it's about climate change. And as companies speak out, there's risk there for sure. They could be boycotted, they could be criticized, the CEO could be maligned, whatever. But at the same time, there's also benefit. And so this is one of the real juggling acts that companies have to think about. How do I speak out? How do I take a position? And how do I make it work for people, planet, and profit?
That's interesting. Well, yeah, and I'm going to keep holding this book up throughout our fireside chat here today. But Bill, one of the things that certainly this book that you've written points to, and that is, and it's been said of you by others, that you have been a pioneer in the area of social marketing. When do you think social marketing came into the lexicon, and at what point did it hit you that social marketing was really where it was at, so that this was something that wasn't going to go away, that it was gaining traction, and you were excited to be aboard that train?
Well, you know, I began in packaged goods commercial marketing, Jim. And I was selling all these exciting products like dog food, soap, cat food, kids cereals. And I had this revelation, and it was that we could apply the same principles to issues, to social issues, to causes, and other ideas. And so it took me a long time to evolve what I did. But, you know, we started Porto Novelli to apply marketing to social and health issues. And we did some pioneering, it's absolutely true. And today I believe that social marketing has a great deal to offer to all the things that Isabella was talking about, that you and I have been talking about. Climate change is a good example. Getting people to get their COVID vaccinations is another example. So marketing is a powerful, powerful discipline, and it can work for us. But one of the lessons, Jim, that I learned, and I know you know this, is that it's not enough. That we've got to create social norms and expectations. And to do that, we need policy change. So if we can work both up at the environmental level and then down at the behavioral level, and combine policy with marketing, I think we've got a really great formula for change.
Let me ask this, and I'll be interested in what you have to say, Bill, and particularly you, Isabella, given where you're sitting at this moment. But is this an American characteristic? Are we more concerned about social marketing and the impact of society more than other parts of the world? And how do we somehow think of this in a more universal sense, thinking about Europe and how Europe really approaches this and thinks about this sort of thing?
Well, I spoke at a international social marketing conference a couple of years ago in Edinburgh. And most of the people there were not Americans. They were from other parts of the world. And I would say that they're ahead of the United States in terms of applying these ideas. But there's one difference, which is that they have less interest in doing partnerships, as I saw it, with corporations.
Oh.
And I think that's a mistake. I think that the big problems that we're dealing with today, whether it's climate change or south to north migration or whatever it may be, they're way too big to have permanent combat and permanent enemies. We've got to get everybody at the table. And that's why partnerships are so important.
Isabella, what do you think, sitting where you are?
That's fascinating. I think that there is quite a progressive movement across Europe and elsewhere about the issues we're talking about. And in terms of the partnerships, this whole development of multi-stakeholder initiatives, MSIs for short, I think that's becoming quite an interesting way where business, government, and civil society can collaborate. And then I'm more universally, in particular, I'm thinking of initiatives such as the United Nations Global Compact, formed about some years ago by the UN Secretary General, but it just started off as an idea that businesses should think about how to be more responsible, which then became 10 principles focusing on human rights and labor rights and environmental questions, and also eventually anti-corruption questions. And it has transformed the sense of a shared expectation around business conduct. Companies sign up to it, or even those that don't are influenced by what the UN Global Compact does. And it has networks literally all the way around the world. So you can find a local network to participate in. And that breaks it down to the local level of how do we work and collaborate. So it's a perfect example of, you have a global governance institution at the UN level, collaborating with civil society, collaborating with businesses, collaborating with finance. And that's been another extraordinary development, how the UN Global Compact is spearheading these collaborations with the financial sector, with banks and with investors and with others, and also setting new standards. Often they are voluntary, but this quote unquote soft law approach can be extremely persuasive. So I find that an extremely encouraging development. And in addition to what the UN Global Compact does with its core principles, of course, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which has emerged from this notion of, and I love the question they asked when they were trying to figure out what it is that we should be doing, is what kind of world do we want? And did a consultation effort across, I mean, the biggest consultation ever to take place, talk about that engagement process, and then shaping a series of goals, including climate change, including about women's empowerment, including about fresh air and water, including about peace and justice and strong institutions. And the 17th goal is partnerships. That's the headline. And so that effort has also concentrated businesses, government, civil societies, and agencies at every level of functioning to say, oh, this isn't going to happen without partnership. And so that is a conscious, deliberate policy exercise at the highest level that permeates, I think, literally has a tremendous global reach now in every corner of the globe, because every country is trying to meet these objectives by the year 2030. It's not been easy. And of course, the pandemic is going to impact what progress can be made. But interestingly, they're also doing a lot of work around the metrics and measurement of social impact, essentially, to Bill's point. How do you start measuring women's empowerment? How do you start measuring some of these other elements that the 17 SDGs bring out? So I'm rather optimistic about a new paradigm that involves collaboration in terms of standards and commitments, but also then on the problem solving side, working together to make a difference in the field on the ground.
Well, when I think back on the last 70, 80 years of US history, one of the things that I'm proudest about being American is what we did just after World War II. And that was the creation of the Marshall Plan in Europe, and watching CEOs earning $1 a year to be able to go off to Japan and to be able to help the Japanese, and on the case of the Marshall Plan, the Europeans, really get out of this morass that they found themselves in the aftermath of the war. And I can remember listening to a U.S. diplomat talk about how he just had tears rolling down his cheeks when he saw the first machine tools made in the United States being delivered to Germany. And when I was given the task of negotiating as the chief negotiator for the United States in what turned out to be the last trade and economic agreement with the Soviet Union, I decided that I wanted very much to use that same model. That at the time, Gorbachev was in power, and there certainly was a trend toward trying to figure out how a central command economy could, in fact, be involved globally in a free market setting. And so we put together a series of joint ventures in which we would be able to work back and forth with CEOs from the United States and top executives with theirs. There were people, particularly at the Defense Department in those days, who said, we're at the end of the Cold War, we won, let them figure it out themselves. But I was very much, and thank God George Shultz, who just passed away recently, and Ronald Reagan were very much, no, that's not the way we do it. We've got to be able to think of their society. We have to think about their people. That's the route that we're going to ultimately go. And so, I think, and at the end of the day, quite frankly, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, it benefited us to be able to think of others and to see that those benefits accrued to them and to us, and we were able to lift the world up as a result. I think it's a wonderful lesson that I hope never ever is forgotten.
That's a great lesson, Jim. That's a terrific lesson. This idea of being bigger than ourselves. We've been talking about the pandemic here. In a way, there may be a silver lining to this pandemic. We've all three probably talked to a lot of nonprofit executives, corporate executives, and I see a lot of them thinking big. And what I think they're saying is we've got to take care of our people. We've got to take care of our communities. But they're thinking bigger than that. They're saying, what kind of a company do we want to be? And bigger than that, what kind of a country do we want to be? And now with climate change and all these other huge issues, we've got to think internationally as well. So it brings us all the way back to where you were. And in a way, it's an opportunity for us that comes out of the trouble of the pandemic.
You bet. And to add to that, Bill, you think about what we've been going through with the coronavirus. Now, clearly, the United States has got to be able to see that the three manufacturers of these vaccines treat the American people and that we become as well as possible. But we've also got to be able to think about other people outside the boundaries of the United States, because at the end of the day, if we don't think about them, we are going to defeat ourselves, because the virus will continue to exist and it will continue to be a threat, all the way around. And so, again, whenever we do good for others, we're doing well for ourselves.
Yeah. When you talked about students raising their hand and say, where can I go and make the most money? I was on the phone. I was on Zoom last night with one of my students. This guy is from Ethiopia. He was in banking for a number of years, and he came back to get his MBA so he could figure out how to make more money. And so I said to him, you're going to do well. Now, what are you going to do with all that money? And he said, I'm going to go back to Ethiopia and I'm going to make a difference. He said, one Ethiopian essentially feeds 4 people. If I can create jobs, I can make a huge difference. So here was a real capitalist. Here was a guy who was interested in banking, interested in money, but he's got that altruistic idea that Isabella was talking about and that you're talking about. And that's why I think we have a bright future.
Yes.
It's a beautiful thought, Bill. And I think that one phrase that captures it for me is this notion of shared prosperity. And I think that really has to be a key feature of this reset, this rebuild, this build back better phase that we're going through now. And I think that ties into these converging crises, whether it's the public health side, which you understand so well, the economic disruption, the social justice question, the climate change question. How do we develop a shared prosperity? And I think that's what was behind how you described also the Marshall Plan, Jim. And I hear that still. I hear that probably every week. Someone says, what we need is a new Marshall Plan to sort of rebuild the society. I hear I hear a reference like, oh, we need a new Marshall Plan to mobilize sustainable finance to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So that idea, I think, still captures the imagination, because I think what they recognize, it's a collaborative effort in a time that's difficult, that everyone bands together, identifies the problem, and tries to work on solving the issues to help everyone. And I think that notion of shared prosperity ties into purpose very well. It's purpose with that notion of shared prosperity underlying it. And I think it's a great policy framing for what's happening now in Washington and in Geneva and in New York and around the world.
That's great. I'm going to take this into a bit of a different direction, if I may. The Washington Institute is going to begin to launch a brand new, very comprehensive program on sports, which is ultimately going to culminate on September 15th with a global sports conference. And I think we're going to have an extraordinary group of people. We were going to have it in June, but unfortunately we had to postpone it because of the coronavirus. But we had people such as Michelle Obama and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I mean, we had famous athletes, business leaders, etc. But one of the elements that we're going to deal with is social responsibility. And it is the one moment, of course, when you think about the Olympics or the World Cup, when you're bringing together the world effectively on the same level playing field, and you have the opportunity to really think about how we are one planet, we are one universe together, and attempting to figure out. I mean, we're working with major corporations that are very familiar to our audience. But how do you think, if I may ask, how sports can be an important aspect in dealing with society and how best to be able to approach it?
Well, I would say this: we have very few universal languages. We have very few universal appeals, and sport is definitely one of them. And so I really think that you're on to a great idea there. I think it's terrific. Now, we have these arguments about should we boycott the Winter Olympics in China?
Right.
Should we do this? Should we do that? I mean, truthfully, sport transcends so many problems, and it's an avenue, it's an opportunity. So I really applaud what you're doing. And if you look at American athletes, and I'm not sure about Europe or other places, but if you look at American athletes, more and more they're figuring out and learning about their responsibility to speak out about racial justice, about inequality, about all these different things that we need to face up to. And so I'm all for it. I think you're doing a great thing.
Well, and I would love to hear you chime in, Isabella. But one of the things I found fascinating last year when we all were able to travel, several of us had the chance, or I should say the year before last, went to 3 sports conferences, global sports conferences. And there was very little at these sports conferences that we attended that gave you a sense of what you just mentioned, Bill. It was kind of people came together once a year, slap one another on the back and say, "Hey, what you been doing since I saw you last? And what do you think about that golfer, that game, whatever?" And it was rather irritating. And so I made up my mind that the Institute was going to have to be absolutely engaged in the aspects of security and technology, corporate social responsibility, trying to deal with infrastructure. It's a sad situation, for example, when companies and governments pay big money to be able to build stadiums, and then after the games are over, they become weed fields, and so really trying to figure out how this has an important impact on society and how business and government can work closely together to be able to make it a success. What are your thoughts about that, Isabella?
What's interesting, and you probably didn't do this consciously, Jim, but as you were talking about it, you said, oh, they're all going to meet because we're going to have a level playing field. Yes. And I was struck by the power of metaphor in sports and how we use them all the time about what is fair, about a good play, about teamwork, about a good captain, all of these values that we see in sports and how it applies to our day-to-day life. So the level playing field. But you raise a fascinating point, which is these major sporting events, I think now are getting scrutiny from their very inception right through the follow-up, what happens once the event is over. And in the interim, really looking at governance questions, at integrity questions, sustainability questions. And one area that I spent quite a lot of time on is on the area of business and human rights, and also looking at how everyone is treated in terms of the building process, the recruiting process of those workers, and what benefit then do they have from that legacy within that particular city. So on the technical side of the major events, I think it's very important. But I think also, I know how much you miss sports, Jim. And it's also like a common language. There's a sense of mutuality, a sense of exchange, a sense of perhaps a bit of tribalism. After all, I live in England, so there's a bit of tribalism associated with it. But there's also, it's something that is so acutely being missed now in the time of pandemic. And it's something that the question is always asked. When can we reopen? How can we reopen safely? And even the idea of having just a few spectators is already something. So I do think it taps into a very important social need. And I think the social benefit, even like you described, the situation with the Soviet Union and the Marshall Plan and post-war, it's also, that is a driving force for a sense of solidarity, the global sports events, I think, if they're well managed.
You froze up on us for a minute there, Isabella. We'll get her back here in a minute.
She'll come back. Yeah, yeah. You know, Jim, I'm sorry. I was going to say that
Please.
all these things we've been talking about really lead to one conclusion, and that's really a sense of legacy. So, you know, in the book, I talk about what do we owe our grandchildren, and it took me a long time to write that chapter.
Yeah.
And I really believe that all the things we've talked about lead us to the conclusion that we've been given a great society, our country, other countries, and that we really need to make it better and to pass it on. And that's what this is all about.
Mm-hmm. So, Bill, do you think that is a good summary of what people should take away from your book?
Well, yes, I do. You know, all four of my grandparents came to this country from somewhere else. And so when I think about immigrant values, you know, I think about love of country, about strength of family, about a reverence for education, an appetite for hard work. You know, those are the values that were both immigrant values, and they're the values that we cherish today. And what we've got to do is we've got to make our country better, we've got to make society better, and we've got to pass it on.
That's great. Isabella, we lost you for just a couple of minutes.
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, not at all.
But I'm back, and I'm really grateful for the comments that Bill is making. And, you know, that last thought was really one of, I think quite incredible, Jim, that there's so much complementarity between the different areas of activity at the Washington Institute. And certainly this passion you have for sports and looking at sports in a systematic way will feed into it.
Well, one of the things that I was fascinated by was that there are all these wonderful recommendations on the book, as books will have. But Mark Morial, who used to be the mayor of New Orleans, who is now the president and CEO of the National Urban League, had this to say: no one matches Bill Novelli's experience, insight, and know-how when it comes to the intersection of business, government, and society. So I thought to myself, well, all these roads are kind of leading in the same direction, and how important it is at the end of the day that we realize that we're shaping the world together, that we've got to be able to understand that we, you know, I'm one of the sayings that I use within the Institute all the time that I think everybody's getting sick of, and that is that silos are for farmers. And the notion we've got to break these things down if we are to progress as a society and as human beings. But anyway, I think we're almost at the end of our wonderful fireside chat. I could have gone on for hours, but I just want to be able to thank you, Bill, so much, and thank you for this wonderful book. Having written a couple of these myself, I know what it takes to be able to put them together. And yeah, both of us will hold them up. And Isabel, I know it's a little later in the day for you in England, but it's been a real pleasure to have you with us. To have somebody from the other side of the pond is great fun, and it's also, I think, awfully important for a discussion like this.
Well, so, thank you so much. It's been a privilege to join you.
Yes, indeed. So thank you all very, very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your questions. It's been a wonderful hour, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.